Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to give the land acknowledgement. I've done this a number of times in the past, and you may have heard some of what I'm going to say, but I'm going to give a very different one today, primarily because of the topic that we're facing today. Bottom line is that traditionally, Haudenosaunee people engaged in burials in a way that the family would take care of their own dead. They would wash and dress the body. They would take care of transportation of the body. They would engage in green burial. There was no embalming. The body would be presented for and honored for 2 to 4 days. In modern time, there is a tendency to use dry ice to keep the body cold, unless it's in the winter time. The traditions vary throughout North America: smudging, prayer songs, items buried with people. There are restrictions on the bereaved relatives on food or what activities they can engage in during the mourning period. Throughout North America, there are other differences. The Inuit people leave the body on the ground for wildlife to consume, and some traditions put the body up on a platform for the wildlife to consume. Now, I think that the two-row wampum is one that we have transgressed in a number of ways. In 1876, Canada introduced the Indian Act enforcing European-style governance, and then residential schools and 60s scoop, effectively destroying the Indigenous culture and causing great harm. That said, the funeral approaches, even those Indigenous people that have become Christians, still include many of the traditional aspects to burials. I think maybe with that I will just leave the land acknowledgement and recognize that it varies a lot from tradition to tradition in Indigenous culture, and that the tendency is in traditional people to engage in green burials, but some interference by religious people, the missionaries and so on, have changed some of those practices. So there was, again, interference with the steering of the canoe. So if you could, I'll stop sharing. Well, I guess I have never shared it, or have I?
Well, I'm sharing mine now, so hopefully people can see my screen.
So I'm going to kick things off in this webinar. And if you could give me the next slide, please, Steve. This is my family. This is my Hamilton family. On the left, Diane, my partner for 33 years, myself, our dog Oztang, and our daughter Keisha. I have 2 other daughters and 2 grandchildren in Victoria. That's Adrian, Jennifer, Oliver, and Junabella. Today I'm going to focus on my family, my Hamilton family. Next slide, please. And for a little while, I'm just going to give you a brief picture of Diane as a person. Diane, some time ago, mentioned to me that she did not want to be cremated. And she said this because she did not want to be releasing CO2 emissions out into the air. She was a very active person. She was an outdoors person. She was my bow paddler. She was my soulmate for 33 years. Next slide, please. I'll just say next from now on.
Yeah.
Not meaning to be rude. Diane and our family traveled usually by bus, by bicycle, hiking, and so on. We did have a car which we used from time to time, but very sparingly. This image shows Diane with her new bike. This bicycle was a present to her. It was the best present I ever gave her, and she used it. She used it all the time. Next. She was also an activist. She was engaged, especially in the Red Hill fight. She tried to protect the Red Hill Valley and worked hard at that, and was devastated when the Valley fight was lost and the road was put through the valley. This led to pollution in the valley, both air pollution and noise pollution. It cut what connected the escarpment to the lake. That corridor was cut off by the expressway, and Diane was devastated by that loss. Now, she did come back. She did not come back with a great fervor at first, but she was involved in many other campaigns, and here you see her in some climate change events. So she was also an activist. Next slide, please. This is a picture showing an image that was taken. This was a period when our daughter Keisha and her partner Ron wanted to reveal that Keisha was pregnant. And on this evening, we were invited over for a nice meal at Beth's house. And after the meal, we went off near the woods to take some pictures. And during that evening, Diane felt the kick of her granddaughter Arlo for the first time. Next slide. On our ride home, we rode home on the rail trail about 5 hours after the previous picture was taken. Diane had a massive brain aneurysm, and within 2 hours, she died from that brain aneurysm. She was declared brain dead. And of course, that threw us into a real haze. Keisha and I were in a state that made it very, very difficult for us to be aware and think through what was going on. But the one thing that I knew was that Diane had requested a green burial. This is a point at which often family members have very little ability to think clearly, and friends become very important. And in this case, Don asked me, what can I do to help? And I said, Don, please, if you can do some research into a green burial and let me know about that, that would be great. His partner Susan actually did the research and sent us a PDF on how to engage in a green burial. And Keisha and I looked at it, and we were just flummoxed. It was great. It was greatly difficult for us in that state to really follow through. And so luckily another friend, Beth, took the PDF and translated it on a spiral bound new paper and gave us points step by step what we needed to do. And so we were able to work through those steps. Next. Diane was kept on life support, kept breathing. Her body was kept alive after she was declared brain dead, primarily because she wanted to donate her organs. And it turned out she couldn't do that because she had cancer much earlier in her life and she had beaten it, but they won't accept organs from someone that has had cancer. But this time that she was kept alive gave us some additional time, which was quite helpful. During that time, we worked with Rochelle Martin. Rochelle provided us with a cardboard coffin that she keeps accessible so that people in a pinch can get that and replace it. We discovered that the cemetery behind our house, Whitechapel Cemetery, would not accept a cardboard coffin. So we went through a funeral home called the Circle of Life and purchased this casket, this coffin. And we had a reception in our backyard where people were allowed or were invited to come to talk with us, to paint on the coffin, and to commiserate about the loss of Diane. Next. So as a community, we gathered, people helped out, young folks, young anarchists and environmentalists from the community who were friends of Diane's and friends of mine and Keisha's, delivered a bunch of food. So we had food to provide for people that came to visit. We talked and cried with people and tried to celebrate as much as we could Diane and her life. On the table to the left that you see there are two pieces of writing that are held down by a toucan and a turtle. The pieces were written by her brothers. Her brothers Rick and Tom were very, very close to Dee. They were not able to come because of COVID restrictions. They lived in the US, and so they were not able to come. But we put out their statements that were very, very important statements. And people visited, and people painted on the coffin, and people wrote notes, and they provided those notes that we would ultimately put in the coffin. Next. Circle of Life delivered Diane back to our family home, and Keisha and Beth and I prepared her body, and we put her in the coffin. We put flowers in her hair. The flowers are sundrops and columbine from our yard. My niece, Jocelyn, brought with her a little spice jar with sand from the beach at Lake DeBorn near Blind River, where this was a family cottage where my parents had first met. And it was a place that was very close to all of us. And we sprinkled the sand at Diane's feet in the coffin. Next. Once the coffin was closed, a number of us wrestled it out of the house and carried it through the backyard and out the back gate to a cart that Circle of Life had allowed us to use. Next. And we pushed and pulled her casket, the coffin, to her burial site. Next. And so people that came, people that were invited, we were slightly over the restrictions that they had in terms of numbers that could be at a burial because of COVID. It was raining appropriately, and we brought with us foods, seasonal foods that were intended to be placed at the grave for various animals to consume. And the reason for that was that Diane and I had belief systems that really reflected very strongly Indigenous worldviews, and we felt it important to recognize that during this period of time, during this burial. Next. We placed flowers on the coffin. Everyone had flowers to place. Next. And this is Wilhelmina Grummond, who officiated at the burial. Her native name in English is Willow River Joe, and she's a Tsalit elder from northern British Columbia who is in our area, and she agreed to officiate. Willow was a very good choice because Willow was a good friend of Diane's. They knew each other back in the Red Hill days, and Willow had been thinking about Diane in the week before she died. So Willow, holding the eagle feather, spoke at the burial. I followed her, and I had the strength to speak only because I knew that Keisha was going to follow me, and she had words prepared. I did my best to get through, to say what was on my mind, and I encouraged all of those in attendance to please emulate Diane and to try to live their lives as anti-racists, to try to follow Indigenous worldview practices, to consider 7 generations along and to sustain the earth as much as possible, to maintain our ecology and our biodiversity. Next, please. This is a picture of Diane's granddaughter, Arlo Fields Claydon Quinn, who was born 3.5 months after Diane died. Next. And Arlo will only know her grandmother through stories and pictures. And this is her at the grave site. Just we're trying to connect her to Diane in some ways. Next. In 2022, which we had a celebration of life for Diane. People came, as was the case in the burial. We encouraged people to wear bright clothes, and we celebrated Diane's life by talking, by giving speeches, by just conversing with each other. Next. And two very important people that could make it this time were Rick and Tom, Diane's brothers. So they were there celebrating her life. This was held at Sealed Art in Hamilton, and we're very grateful for access to that place. That was a place that Diane and Keisha knew well. There were many celebrations at Sealed Art, and we were involved in a lot of them because Diane and I connected quite well with the young crowd, and we're often invited to these events. Next, please. The event had music. Some of it was excellent music by good musicians, and some of it perhaps including the way we wrapped up with a group sing-along, which you see in the lower left of this slide. We ended the festivities, which lasted over 4 hours, with a singing of Bob Dylan's Forever Young. It was a pretty rough rendition. It was not nearly as beautiful as the rendition that was played as Diane's coffin was lowered into the ground. We played a version of Forever Young by what's her first name? Rhianna Giddens version of Forever Young. And it was very beautiful. And after it was finished, the rain stopped and the sun came out, and we went home and had a follow-up visit with everyone that could stay, and friends jumped in and prepared food, and we just supported each other. Next, please. This picture was taken a few days ago. This is Arlo trying to find the hidden animals, the small animals that are in the background in the picture of Diane's marker. Her marker, next please, was designed, and the art was done by our artist in our family. Keisha did all the artwork for this marker. And I guess I would have to say, just to wrap things up, a few take homes, I guess, maybe, that friends are very important in these times, and they're very helpful, and friends got us through this burial. When Diane was lowered into the ground and the actual burial was done, Keisha and I looked at each other and we said we did it right. We were able to bring this off. And Diane would have approved of the green burial that she got. I would say also, though, as perhaps some advice, if you are thinking about this, think about it ahead of time. Be prepared. There are things to be done. We did it in a way that we didn't contract it out. We didn't, the way you might have some contractor come in and do your bathroom up or something like that. We did not do that. We did not call on a funeral home and to take this all away from us. We were deliberately and intimately involved with this process. And it was emotionally very important. It was hard, but it was important. And I encourage you, if possible, to recognize the importance of your loved ones by being directly involved. And I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to kick it over to Rochelle.
Thanks so much for sharing that story, Jim. I have heard your story a couple of times, and I really am touched by it every time I hear it. And I just think that what you and Keisha and your friends and community did in that just shocking, traumatic moment was so amazing. And I'm really glad every time I hear you say that it was good for you, because that's my belief, that when families are able to do the, as you said, hard and good work of caring for loved ones after death, that it really is, it's really good. I mean, as good as anything can be in such sad times. So anyway, thank you for sharing that and being so generous, even with showing us the images from that time. Like, I think for people who've never had the opportunity to witness family-led death care, it means a lot to be able to see photos of families doing it, that it's possible, that it's not scary, that it, you know, all of these things. So thank you very much for sharing those with everyone who is here today. So I'm going to talk a bit about family-led death care. It goes by a lot of names. Sometimes you'll hear home funeral, you'll hear family-led death care, you'll hear community-based death care, and they all kind of mean the same thing. It's about us sort of taking back the care of our dead, our beloved dead, and doing that ourselves instead of hiring it out to industry professionals. So next slide, please. The way it goes, I think we'll just start with the with the bad news. The way it often works in our society, for many Canadians, is unfortunately we often die in hospitals or long-term care homes. Sometimes we die at home, but regardless of where we die, in the end, our next of kin will employ a funeral director to take care of things. And what that means is the funeral service provider professional will pick up our body from a morgue, probably a basement of a hospital or a long-term care facility, or come to the home if the home's died and pick up the body. Body will go in a body bag to either a funeral home if it's still doing the embalming there, and often, increasingly, you'll go to the body will go to an industrial park where embalming happens sort of on an assembly line. And embalming is the draining of all the blood, replacing it with formaldehyde. And there's a big trocar. It's kind of like a vacuum cleaner. They puncture the abdomen, suck out internal organs, and stuff in your abdomen and fill that body cavity with fluid, embalming fluid. Unfortunately, this embalming fluid is toxic to the mortuary workers who are doing this. So this gory scene happens, and then they make the body up with makeup. They use a lot of tricks, like with wiring, jaws shut and gluing eyes shut, and makeup, and trying to make the body look, I think they think lifelike, but we've also been to viewings, and often bodies are kind of scary looking, just in that they do look kind of made up and kind of fake. And that is the sad story up to that point. Then we have a visitation where we're in a funeral home. We have a few hours to parade past the body, receive family and friends, and then usually the body is delivered again by the funeral home in a hearse to a place of burial or cremation. And Susan will talk more about the way our current burials often happen. But at that point too, there's cement vaults in the ground, there's non-biodegradable caskets used, there's emissions going into the air with cremation that aren't good. So in all of this, I guess I would say that our current practice is often very commercialized. We're told that we're kind of upsold on caskets that we're told demonstrate the extent of our love for the person who died. And in many ways, these practices are environmentally harmful. They're very expensive. And in many ways, they distance and disconnect us from our loved ones and from community involvement. So next slide, please. How did we get here? It's kind of interesting that North America is really the only place where embalming, at least, is such a thing. Like in Europe, embalming doesn't usually happen, doesn't happen in Central and South America or Africa. It's a sort of our thing. And where it got started on this continent was during the Civil War, actually. Doctors were figuring out how to preserve bodies. And ironically, the purpose of preserving the bodies of these fallen Civil War soldiers was so that bodies would last on their long cart rides back to their families. So the point was to be able to get the body back home for the home funeral, ironically. But since then, it's become part of the funeral industrial complex, where embalming is the most lucrative service that funeral directors provide. So as often, embalming will just be part of the package. And it all kind of started with this Civil War intervention where they were trying to get bodies home to families. So recently, there's been a movement to reclaim family-directed and community-based death care, and I'll tell you a little bit about that right now. Next slide. So first of all, I'll just say that there's nothing wrong with funeral directors, and I personally know a couple here in this area that are very encouraging of family-directed funerals and home funerals, and are very willing, like Circle of Life in Dundas that Jim mentioned, very willing to help families do whatever particular things the family needs help with. So that is great. And what I'm speaking here is not so much to disparage funeral directors, that's for sure. I do feel like the funeral industry deserves a bit of disparaging, but I'm not out to disparage funeral directors. I am out to try and talk people into caring for their own loved ones at home. And I'll tell you a bit about why. So reclaiming death care, we can have practices that are more natural, instinctive, nourishing, ecologically sustainable for people on our planet. We're trying to get back to how we used to do it. And believe me, it wasn't long ago that even in Canada, we would care for our own dead. It's only really been in the last 100 years that we've started thinking that our only option is to hand over our bodies to funeral directors. So it leads to re-engagement and participation with death, and it definitely considers the environmental impact. That's a very important part of it, and something that we'll focus on today. Next slide. So death care options. It is the responsibility of the next of kin. So that would be the partner of the person who died, or the parent of the person who died, or the child of the person who died, depending on the situation, to deal with the body of someone who's died. And it's only that most families choose to hire out that care of the body that we wind up having funeral directors doing most of our after death care. So I think that's an important thing to just get our minds around, that it's actually your job and it's your legal responsibility to care for the body. And it's only because you might choose to hire a funeral director to do it for you that a funeral director is involved at all. It's just because families choose to hire them, not because they're required in any way, shape, or form. So I'm going to talk about how family-led death care is safe, legal, affordable, and sustainable. Next slide. So family-led death care, as I was saying before, is just death care directed and carried out by family and friends. This after-death care might occur in your home or in a church or in a community space. And I think Jim's slides showed you all sorts of different scenes. You saw some care of the body in his home. You saw some decorating and gathering, decorating of the coffin and gathering of people in his backyard. You saw people carrying the body to a cemetery that happened to be in his backyard or behind his backyard. And then also you saw a celebration of life that happened in an art studio. So that's a great example of all sorts of different spaces where after death care by families can occur. Families can transport the body, file all the necessary death registry paperwork and documents, and then families can choose to involve the funeral industry for services at any point as they choose. And I think Jim's story also exemplifies that really well. Jim was talking about the difficulty, with the cardboard coffin that he borrowed from me and then needed to have a wooden coffin. And this eco coffin that he ended up getting was sold by a company that only sold direct to funeral providers and didn't sell to the public. So he used a funeral provider, Circle of Life in Dundas, to arrange to get the coffin, and they were happy just to do that for him. And then he asked Circle of Life to do the transportation of Diane's body from the hospital where she died to their home, and they agreed to do just that. And I believe, Jim, that you also had Circle of Life do the paperwork too. And so these are just examples of a couple of services that Jim and Keisha decided that they wanted to have help with, and then other things they decided it would be meaningful to do themselves. Next slide, please. So why should you consider family-led death care? I really think there are psychosocial, spiritual benefits of that hands-on involvement in death care. And you heard Jim testify to that when he was talking about turning to Keisha at the very end of it all and saying we did good. And I think that you can't even know probably how meaningful it can be till you witness it and then are involved in it yourself. Everyone that I know who's provided care to a loved one after death has really found it profoundly helpful in their grieving process. And one of the theories we sometimes talk about is the continuing bonds theory. And that's this idea, it's a grief and bereavement theory, that the more that we can engage with our loved ones during and after death, the more we are able to maintain that bond with someone after they've died. And it helps in the grieving process. So I do think that this sort of move to be more involved is really helpful in healthy grieving. There are definitely environmental and financial benefits. When families choose, as Jim and Keisha did, what products they're going to buy, they can be conscientious about the environmental impact. They can think about how just the carbon footprint of everything they do. They can make a choice to bury, for example, in the cemetery behind them, where they could just walk the body there. There's many choices that benefit the environment. Choosing not to embalm is a great way of benefiting the environment. And as Jim said, not cremating is of great benefit to the environment. I think that's a misconception that people often have, that cremation is somehow more environmentally friendly than conventional burial. It's not. So, and I believe Susan will talk a bit more about that at the end when she talks about green burial. So another thing that Jim's story highlights, I think, is the community building implications of caring for our own. Jim talked about how important it was to have people bring food for their gatherings, people to contribute to the to decorating the coffin, to the Remembrance of Life ceremony. Like, in all of these ways, the community came together and supported each other. Or even just in those initial days when Jim was talking about needing his friends to help him figure out like just what to do after the shock of Diane's death. So I think in all of those ways, family and friends can be involved in a way that helps people feel like they've been able to contribute in some way. I know that after friends, loved ones die, we say, you know, if there's anything I can do, and we mean it. And yet usually there's nothing we can do really, because when we hire out death care, there's just not a lot of tasks to do. But when you do care for a loved one after death at home, there are things, tangible things that people can do to contribute. And you can ask people for help with that. Help to source the coffin, help to decorate, help to feed people, help to host, help to do all of these tasks. And I do think as a community, it brings people together to mourn that death in a way that you can't do when you're just 2 hours together at a visitation in a funeral home. And related to that, the last point on that slide, goodbyes end up unfolding in their own way and in their own time. Grief is messy and just happens when it happens. And if all you got is your 2-hour visitation, and that's your chance, you know, it just seems so awful to have to cram your moments and your grief into that time. And when people keep a body at home for a few days, they have that time for the goodbyes to happen naturally and as unfold sort of in their own way. Next slide, please. So Everyone wants to know if caring for your loved one at home is safe. And I think the funeral industry has done a good job of making us think it's not. Funeral directors will tell you, for example, that bodies have to be embalmed, and they don't. It is true that a funeral home can say that a body has to be embalmed if you want to have a visitation in their funeral home, and that's their prerogative as a owner of the business. But it is not a truism for health and safety reasons. And if you're keeping a body at home, you do not need to embalm a body. There's no reason to embalm a body. It preserves it for a little bit longer, not even a lot longer. And there are ways to naturally and in environmentally friendly ways preserve a body at home. And that's through dry ice or Techni ice, or just any old ice pack, or just air-conditioned room. If a body is staying at home for just a day or two, you don't even need to worry about cooling. So these are things that we can do that are safe and easy and environmentally friendly. And it's good. It's good to know that there are statements from the World Health Organization and lots of other public health bodies that say that dead bodies are not a public health risk. Now, next slide, please. I know some of you are thinking anthrax and Ebola and hemorrhagic fever, and you are right. In these odd cases, bodies are not safe for families to deal with at home. You look at that list, and it's just not likely that your loved one will die of these things. So I want you to see that list just to know that there are a few things that might prevent you from providing after-death care at home, but they're not likely to happen to your loved one. Next slide, please. So next question people have, is caring for your loved one at home after death legal? And yes, it is. Family-led death care is legal in all Canadian provinces. Quebec has recently, unfortunately, had a very strong funeral industry lobby and has gotten the time limit down to 24 hours for families caring for their loved ones at home, basically saying bodies need to be buried, cremated, or embalmed within 24 hours. And that is very limiting for families who want to provide after-death care at home. Doesn't make it impossible, and still permits Jewish and Islamic traditions where bodies are buried usually within 24 hours, but without embalming. But it does really put pressure on families. And the law was changed precisely to advantage the funeral industry and force embalming on people, which is sad but true. Anyway, in every other province, we can do this without any time limits. There is no limit on how long you can keep your loved one's body at home. It's true. Usually families that care for their loved ones at home, a normal amount of time is 2 or 3 days. There's no reason you can't do it longer if that's what you want. As I said before, it is the next of kin's both right to care for the body and responsibility. I always tell people, when you hear someone say that it's illegal and that you can't, you just need to educate and insist. And often there's a sort of a paternalistic attitude coming from either from hospitals or long-term care homes that don't want to release bodies to family members to take them home after death, or from funeral directors who will say, oh, it would just be so hard on the family to see, to see them in this state. By that they mean after their loved one, after they've died. And as a nurse who's worked in a ER, it was my job to help families hear the news that their loved one had just died in ER, usually suddenly and traumatically because they died in ER. And in every instance, when families have that chance to see the body, even in those really awful traumatic situations, I hear families leaving the resuscitation room when they've had that opportunity to see the body and say goodbye, saying things like, that was so important, I did that, we were there with her till the end. Just really vocalizing how important it was to be there for their loved one after death. And that's in situations that aren't, beautiful, peaceful deaths at home. So I think that there is a lot of trumped up fear of seeing and being with our dead loved ones, and that the reality of death is much less disturbing to people than a funeral director or a hospital administrator would have families believe when they try and talk families out of caring for their loved ones at home. Next slide, please. This is a chart that might not look very, very special to you, but this chart is, you can put it on my tombstone, that there is a final column. I mean, please don't put it on my tombstone. I don't even want a tombstone, but there is a final column there. It says family of deceased on the far right. Check, 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 check. All those check marks say all of the things that families can do. And this is put out by the Bereavement Authority of Ontario. They regulate the funeral industry. They say what funeral directors can do, what transfer services can do, what cemeteries can do, what crematoriums can do, and what families of the deceased can do. And look at all of these things we have a legal right to do. If you go further down, we cannot embalm bodies, because that's a licensed thing that only funeral directors can do, thank goodness. We cannot sell plots in cemeteries because, obviously there are things we can't do, but most of the important after death care things we can do. And we have this column now because some Community Death Care Canada, Ontario Legislative Committee people, we badgered the BAO till they gave us a column, just so that when anyone looks at this Bereavement Authority of Ontario information, they see right there in writing that families have the right to do it. And families have always had the right to do it. It's just that the BAO didn't have a column indicating that we could. And now we have something to show anyone, anytime, that says, hey, look, this, and this, we can do all these things. So that's very exciting to finally have that.
Rochelle, there was a question
Next
earlier
slide,
from Gail asking if it's possible to bury a body on the property of the deceased in Ontario. And I see on your chart here, you've got providing in-ground graves. Does that relate to the question?
Yeah. Family cannot provide in-ground graves. And I'm going to save that question for Susan because she's going to be the expert on that one. But it's a good question. Next slide. Thank you. So families can fill out all of the paperwork. Registering a death is much like registering a birth. When you have a baby and need to fill out the birth registration information, these are all of the steps and things you need to do. Next slide, please. If you look on my Funeral Alternatives website, you'll see we have developed a kind of a flow sheet for funeral related paperwork, one for each province. I don't think we have all the provinces and territories, but we have most of the major ones there. So you can click on those and it tells you exactly what you need to do and when and where you need to do it if you did want to take care of that death registry yourself. And I would say if you have a friend who is sort of into filling out paperwork, I mean, I myself personally kind of like doing forms and that sort of thing. So it could be that you have someone in your life that enjoys doing that and could do that for you if a loved one died, or at least fill it out and then have you sign it and all that. But this is often one thing that families don't particularly enjoy doing and find intimidating. And this is one service that you might want to hire a funeral director to do just that, just to file the paperwork. So that's one thing to consider. Next slide, please. Family-led death care is affordable. That's another thing, that not a reason to do it, I don't think, but it's a bonus. We can do all of these things. We can file the documents, make cemetery arrangements, care for the body in non-invasive and simple manner, use locally sourced and crafted funeral goods, file online and paper obituaries, and transport the body. Yes, we can transport the body in our own vehicles, and you don't need a super big hearse to transport a body. Any minivan, if you take out if the middle seats fold down and the back seat folds down, you can get a coffin in the back of a minivan. So the cost really could be almost nothing. The unavoidable costs, of course, are burial or cremation, but the actual care of the body could be almost nothing. Next slide. And most importantly for this presentation, family-led death care is eco-friendly. We can do care for bodies in ways that are natural, non-invasive. We can use caskets, urns, or shrouds that are made with biodegradable and sustainable material. We can shop local in this regard. We can make sure that we're not using any polluting or toxic chemicals. And boy, funeral industry care is full of polluting and toxic chemicals. We can ensure a low carbon footprint. And this family-led death care fits really well with the choice for natural burial. And with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Susan. I have one last slide that just shows some resources. You can go to any of these places for lots of different resources if you want to learn more and read more about after-death care at home. And thanks. Susan, off to you.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank Jim for that beautiful, intimate story. And Rochelle was being modest, but she has been a huge champion of advocating for family rights in home funerals. So thank you, Rochelle. And I'm going to start by answering that question because I'll forget otherwise. You cannot legally in Ontario bury on private property. Theoretically, you can't even bury cremated remains on private property. I would think that's kind of a law we might want to ignore, but I hope that answers the question. Ding, next slide, please. So quickly, I'll just tell you what our organization is, what natural burial is, why people like it, what's happening around Ontario, answer the most common questions that we get. And if you're interested in it, I will give you some ideas of ways you can help the movement. Ding. So we're an organization focused on getting natural burials here in Canada, here in Ontario. We're all volunteers. It's a nonprofit organization, but we have a partnership with a charity, so we're able to accept donations. And we're building awareness. So many people don't know what natural burial is, about 50% of the Ontario pop. Hopefully that's changing. We're fighting the government on a couple of fees, which I'll tell you about the one big one later. And we support local advocates. There's advocates all around the communities who want to have a natural burial ground in their own respective community. And we're looking for land for a dedicated natural burial ground. Ding. So what is natural burial? I'll start with what happens below ground. The body is buried in a biodegradable casket or a shroud. It could be a pine box, wicker basket, without the metal, without the varnished hardwood. And the grave is not 6 feet under. It's at about 3.5 feet down. That's where all that rich soil strata is, where the mycelium is, where your body is really, really contributing to the earth's renewal. The body, of course, isn't embalmed. And some people aren't aware that in many cemeteries, they have bylaws that insist that there's a vault that even surrounds the coffin. That is to help keep the land flat so it's easier for them to mow. Now, when we refer to natural burial, though, in the vernacular, it's now used to encompass also what happens above ground. And at a natural burial ground, the land is restored and protected in its natural ecohabitat. You will be looking at woodland. You'd be looking at a field, a meadow. It doesn't look like a cemetery. Tombstones are replaced with either a small local flat stone or a communal marker, like a boulder that's got the names on it. Or sometimes there isn't a marker. It's GPS that's used to determine where the grave is. Ding. So natural burial is, as Rochelle indicated, it's not a new idea. This has been around from time immemorial. It's practiced today by Muslims and Jews. It's just something that's getting renewed attention. And this is the one option at end of life, which is not an engineered process. It's natural. Ding. I really wanted to emphasize this. This is my favorite slide. I wanted to emphasize it today because I know I have an audience of environmentalists. And I'll be honest, when I heard about natural burial, I was all excited about it because of the environmental benefits. But as I've been doing this for the last couple of years, I've learned that this is only one of many reasons why people like natural burial. And it's been incredibly moving for me to learn about this. It's giving back to nature, the environmental element, not harmful like cremation. It aligns with many people's faiths and their traditions. They love that their final resting place is going to be in nature forever and that they're part of the cycle of life. It's almost humbling that you become part. You're, in essence, giving back to the bugs and leaving a legacy because you're protecting that nature in perpetuity. And it's a nice place for those future generations to visit. And just the simplicity of it all. I'm trying to go really quickly, but I will read these two quotes. We get beautiful, we call it fan mail that comes into our office, and there's a QR code there if you want to see the homepage of our website that's got tons of fan mail, but a couple here. What better way to honor what nature has given me than to give myself right back? The thought of allowing my body and soul to rest among nature makes me feel less sorrowful about dying. So it really is humbling and beautiful and simple that it appeals to so many people. Next, please. And to reinforce how you can't stereotype about it being a lefty, hippie, environmental movement at all. Look at here, we did a survey just before the last provincial election, and you can see all the parties are interested in natural burial. The majority of people would, yeah, I would consider a natural burial. So good news there. We're really happy about that. Next, and that goes for age, it goes for education, it goes for region of Ontario. Everybody, the majority of people in all the different categories are pro. I have to do this little vocab thing. You'll hear it referred to as green burial, and you'll hear it referred to as natural burial. We're really trying to emphasize the word natural burial just because, as we know, there's a little bit of a movement against all this woke stuff and environmentalists. And green is an environmental term, but when we say natural, we just are encompassing something that's resonates with more people. So that's why we try to, if you're talking about hearing this today, would love it if you refer to it as natural burial. The other thing that I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides is there's two kinds of natural burial grounds. There's hybrids, and those are the small natural sections that are created within the conventional cemeteries. And then there's the dedicated sites, which are alone in nature. You're absolutely enveloped in nature. They're usually much bigger, anywhere from 10 acres to 100 acres. We only have one in Canada. I'll show you that one later, but there's dozens and dozens, not over 100 in the United States and in the UK. Ding. So too much to go through right now. But again, there's another QR code. On our website, we've listed all the hybrids. That's all we have in Ontario, the hybrids that are across the province. You're in Hamilton, one recently opened at Mount Hamilton. It's about an acre, sort of circular acre with lots of wildflowers there. And there's like so many coming down the pipeline. It's really, really growing. There's some with greenwash, and there's some that are really, truly beautiful and align with all the real tenets of natural burial. Ding. So here, Canada's only public natural burial ground is in Salt Spring Island, and it's 13 acres of Douglas fir forest. It's just so stunningly beautiful. You drive up a winding road past Kathy and Gavin's farm, and then in the background, there you are. It goes a little higher into the woods. It's like green, 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 lush with ferns. And there is the natural burial ground that they run. You can see a ceremony taking place right there. It's stunningly, stunningly beautiful. So that's what we're hoping for here in Ontario, minus the Douglas fir, of course. Next slide, please. So some commonly asked questions about natural burial. Does it poison the water? It doesn't, with the exceptions that Rochelle mentioned earlier. Pathogens die when we die. There's nothing to transmit them, so no, it doesn't poison the water. But nonetheless, natural burial grounds follow the same regulations that conventional cemeteries do. So there's rules about how the body has to be separated from the water table and that kind of thing. Do scavengers dig out the bodies? No, not at all. We're too deep down. They're not interested in us at all. All the natural burial grounds in the States and the US, all the Muslim and Jewish burials, you don't hear about the bones coming up to the surface or the graves being dug. It just doesn't happen. Next slide, please. Are there winter burials? I'm going to skip this because I know in Hamilton, yes, there are, but there are some where they don't have them. Sometimes we get a question, well, if there's no marker, then how will I know where the grave is? Legally, every cemetery has to be able to tell you where a grave is. It's usually by GPS. Sometimes there's a little metal tag, but always you can exactly locate the grave. But the idea a little bit with the natural burial grounds or the dedicated natural burial grounds is that it's not that 8x3 grave that is yours. It's more that all of that beautiful natural expanse, you're part of all of that legacy. So not, the feel like all of that is what you're contributing towards. As far as the price is concerned, every cemetery sets their own bylaws. And so, possible to give the prices right now. Typically, it's usually, way, way, way less expensive than conventional burial, but usually is a little bit more expensive than cremation. It does compare to it does matter where you live as far as the price of cremation. And I should mention that if you don't like Mount Hamilton or the hybrid wherever you do live, what Jim did was there wasn't officially a natural burial ground in the cemetery where Diane is, but every cemetery, even if they have bylaws that say you have to have a vault, they have to have a section where you don't have to have a vault. So if there's a section where you don't have to have a vault, and they cannot force you to embalm, and they cannot force you to buy a hardwood casket, then in essence, you're having a natural burial. It just doesn't have the restoration of the nature happening on top as it would in a natural burial ground. Ding. Rochelle touched on this cremation. Most people are on the assumption that cremation is eco-friendly because, of course, that's how it was positioned relative to conventional burial. And now we're almost after COVID, up to about 75% of Ontarians are opting for cremation, partly because there's just such that sanitation of death care has taken over, contrary to all the beautiful elements of the home funeral and the involvement that Rochelle and Jim have spoken of. But cremation is really harmful. In essence, it puts so much carbon dioxide in the environment. You're taking about 2 SUV tanks full of gas to burn a body for 3 hours at 800 degrees Celsius. And if they don't have the latest, greatest filter, which most of the incinerators don't, then you're putting other toxins into the environment. Also, as far as the cremated remains, the ashes, which of course aren't really ashes, they are the pulverized bones, are too sweet for the soil, very high alkaline, and the sodium content is very, very, very high. So they are harmful to the soil and to the foliage where they're scattered. Next slide, please. I do want to take one page, if I could, just to quickly tell you about one of the issues that we're fighting with the government, and that is a fee. It's called the Care and Maintenance Fund fee that Ontario poses on every grave that you buy, whether it's for cremation or full body burial. So let's say that burial interment rate costs $1,000. 40% of that has to be stashed away in a fund for the long-term maintenance of the care of the cemetery. This goes into that cemetery's fund. The national average is 13%. So it really, really inflates the price of burial. And for natural burial, it doesn't make any sense at all because, as you can imagine, it's much less expensive to maintain a natural burial ground. You're not mowing, you're not fixing the tombstones. So we think this is highway robbery, and it's just a tax on those that are in grief. And so we would ask if you could go to our website, and you'll see a Fees in Ontario page, and there's like click a button, put in your postal code, send a letter off to the MPP campaign that we have in the marketplace right now. Next slide, please. There's our website. If you'd like to have a look, if you liked what you heard about natural burial, please spread the word gently. Share that cremation isn't eco-friendly. People are usually really appreciative to learn that, but obviously we don't do it with a judgmental angle. And we sign up on our website, follow us on social media, all the presence that we have 15,000 followers on social media, if you can believe it. I don't know why anybody would follow anything to do with our cemeteries, but it's great that they do. So we know that there's huge demand for natural burials. I think that's probably my last slide. One more, maybe. There we are. I think we're over to questions. I went through that very quickly. I hope wasn't too quick.
No, that was great, Susan. That was very informative, and also Rochelle and Jim, a very touching presentation indeed, as a lot of people in the chat are expressing. So if anyone wants to ask any questions of any of the presenters, raise your hand while you're thinking of that. In the meantime, there are a couple of entries in the chat. So there's a comment from Neil Bonner saying that he's been following a website called Recompose Life based in Washington State, and wondering what the situation is, if there's any movement in Canada, although some energy is apparently required to compost a body. Does anyone? Yeah, do you want to take that?
I can field that question. It's called human composting or natural organic reduction, and it's legal in about 9 states now. It's not legal anywhere in Canada. And what happens is the body is placed in a vessel with a lot of microbial material and moisture and heat, and over a period of about 6 weeks, it turns into soil. Midway through, they open up the vessel and remove the bones and pulverize them, and then put that in. And at the very end, the end result is about 2 wheelbarrows full of soil, which can be taken to the cottage or given to a land trust. And to the best of my knowledge, there was an advocacy group in Ontario that was pushing for it, and it just lost steam because it's just not, it takes so much money to get it up and going. So I don't know that there's an active group engaged in fighting for NOR here in Ontario. A little bit of an action in BC, so probably happen in BC first, and then it will be easier to get it in Ontario.
There's another question from Andrew asking if you know whether terramation is an option in Ontario. I would like to know what terramation is.
That's a brand name for human composting. It's the same name, terramation.
Okay. And from Linda, if you can't bury a body on private property, this is a follow-on from the previous question, is there a process to get the legal support to get part of a, quote, farm, unquote, property to be designated as a burial ground? So I guess, do you have to go with this hybrid approach, or is there some alternative to that?
Right, farms are difficult. I mean, we're looking for land, and we avoid land which is zoned A1 ag, just because you saw with the fight for the green belt, nobody wants to give up any agricultural land, and which is tough because the farmers really, really endorse the idea of natural burial. But as it stands now, land zoned rural is much more conducive to natural burial than land zoned A1.
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, I should say, in the UK, it's so different. There's farmers that might have a little patch of their property which isn't conducive to farming, and they lend it out to natural burial. Like, so beautiful. You'll have like a little natural burial section. Of course, there's nature all around, and on the other, just on the around the outside of the hedge, you'll see all those sheep looking in as there's a little burial taking place in the natural burial section. And sometimes if there's a funeral taking place, they'll phone the farmer and he can make a little extra cash with the backhoe digging the grave. So it's really a lovely synergy in the UK, but there's a lot of laws in Ontario.
Question from Gail. Does one purchase a specific plot from a natural cemetery?
That would depend. Every cemetery is different. When we open a natural burial ground, what we would do is have different sections. You could have the section with the milkweed, the butterfly section. You could have another section where it's pollinators for the bees, sort of thing. So you'd choose little sections. But the best bet, as far as the ecological restoration, is to fill in the graves from the back and then move forward as you do the rehabilitation. So normally it's in that section that you would be, not in a specific grave. Again, also partly in keeping with that, it's not just that 8x3 that is your memory. It's all of that beauty, that natural beauty all around you.
Although I'll just say in Mount Hamilton's green burial section, so this is an example of a hybrid cemetery, you are buying a burial plot. So you could theoretically buy 2 plots next to each other for you and your partner and die at different times and both be buried in those precise plots, which I don't know, Sue, would you say that's probably more common in hybrid cemeteries where they're selling individual specific plots?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
This question from Sherry. There was a burial pod at the death show at the ROM in Ontario. Is that available?
It doesn't even work. It's just this thing that's captured. I think it's the one that's it's called Monday or something, right? Beautifully designed from Italy. Yeah, it's just captured the imagination of people. It's great, gets the conversation going, gets people thinking about death, but it doesn't even work. Yeah, you can't have a tree sapling start right on top of a body like that.
And a question from Sarah. Any comments on aquamation in terms of environmental impact?
Ooh. I like to dodge that question. Rochelle, would you like to take that?
From what I understand, aquamation is more environmentally friendly than cremation and less environmentally friendly than natural burial. It's kind of in between. So it's a better option than cremation. I believe that, for example, the Roman Catholic Church has said no to aquamation because of the body being kind of liquefied and ending up going down the drain, which is a little bit a double standard, because the Roman Catholic Church is permitting embalming, and in embalming, people's blood and even organs are going down the drain. So it's kind of a double standard. But currently, aquamation is from an environmental perspective better than cremation. I think we also have to ask ourselves about like our responsibility environmentally in our particular location. Like here in Canada, I don't think we need those technologies like recompose, human composting or aquamation or these things, because we do have land that we can preserve and support wildlife and diversity and human use. We can do that by burying ourselves in the way that Sue was talking about, through conservation burial, through natural burial. We have the land in Canada. If we lived in very densely populated areas where we didn't have land that we could conserve through natural burial, then I think some of these more environmentally friendly options like human composting and aquamation, those start making sense in places like Japan. And just, we don't need that here in Canada. I guess that's my opinion. I don't know, Sue, if you would agree.
Yeah, it takes so much water. I don't know why we would do it. I think it takes a lot of water. There's questions. I mean, in BC, they've looked at it and they won't allow it because of what the discharge that goes into the water system. And I don't like it emotionally. It's disturbing to me because the body is disrobed before it's put in this vessel and sort of shaken and stirred. It upsets me to think about that happening, even more so than the cremation.
Okay, a question from Kathy. There is a new cemetery going in beside the Dundas Driving Park. Would they be required to have a section that allows for natural burial as they had to Whitechapel Cemetery for Jim's partner, Diane?
Susan, restate what you said. This was news to me, even, that you can bury green anywhere in Ontario, in any cemetery. They're obligated to bury you without a cement vault.
Yep, you might not get to choose exactly which section you're going to be in, but they legally have to have a section of the cemetery in which you're not required to have a vault. So you're not required to have a vault. You don't need to embalm. No one can force you to buy a hardwood casket. So therefore, you can be buried naturally in some section of that cemetery that's about to open. Now, it's probably, because I don't know about it, that would mean it's not going to have a natural burial section. So that would mean the stuff on top that we talked about, bringing back the natural restoration, native grasses, pollinator flowers, that kind of thing. It sounds like that's not going to take place. But you could certainly, as far as giving your body back to the earth and contributing to renewal, on any cemetery in Ontario, that can happen.
Okay, that's it for the questions. There was one about cost, but I think you answered that in one of your later slides, Susan. So there were a lot of expressions of appreciation for these three presentations. People saying that they learned a lot from this. So thank you, all of you for the effort that you've put into doing this. And if there are no more questions, then I'd like just to reiterate that there's a lot of people on this call that we haven't heard from before. So if anybody came later and you'd like to be put on our distribution list, if you're not already on it, then please put your email address in the chat, and we'll make sure that you get on our list for subsequent presentations. We usually have one a month, third week, third Wednesday of each month. So, Don, do you have any updates from a Hamilton 350 perspective before we end the presentation?
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks again for the presentations this evening. This has been, in my view as well, a really helpful and important presentation. Hamilton 350 Committee is the climate action group in Hamilton, and we have a number of subgroups, and I want to emphasize a couple of things before everybody disappears. One is that there is a public action taking place on Friday at 12 noon at the Bank Corner in Dundas. That's the corner of Sydenham and King, where all four of our 5 major banks have branches. The action is directed at the banks, specifically at the Royal Bank, but all 5 Canadian large banks are funding major funding sources for fossil fuel infrastructure, tar sands, pipelines, and so on. So the effort has been underway for a long time to convince the banks to stop doing this, to start acting responsibly. And the Elders for Climate Sanity group, which is part of Hamilton 350, is leading this action on Friday. It's at 12 noon. And I encourage you to come and join and support this action to increase the voice. So that's one. Second is that we have a new law being debated in the legislature in Ontario, which is going to increase the rates for the people who are still using so-called natural gas, either for water heaters or for home heating or whatever. What happened is that the provincial regulator has made a decision back in December that it's unfair and unreasonable to continue a practice whereby gas users are forced to pay for installation of new gas lines in new subdivisions in new locations, and that instead that should be paid for by the developer, who currently doesn't have to pay for it, or in many cases the Energy Board expected that people won't use gas. They will go to the logical step that everybody should be moving towards, which is a heat pump, a non-gas using facility that both air conditions and heats homes, and is less costly and doesn't generate any carbon emissions. So that legislation is in front of the provincial government at this point, because the province has decided in its infinite wisdom, the day after, something like 20 hours after the decision was made, the Minister of Energy came out and said, oh, we're going to overthrow that. We're going to get rid of that rule. We're going to go back to the rule that everybody has to pay, everybody as a gas user has to pay for the installation of new lines. The cost implications aren't entirely clear, but they look to be about $120 per year per household. And this would be a reduction in the existing gas charges because this has been the practice in the past. The Energy Board, independent regulator, had said, we don't need to continue doing this, and it's unjustified. The province is overruling them, and in addition is firing the head of the Ontario Energy Board. Another example of a provincial government that thinks it should be the absolute master of everything and decide everything. And you may have noticed they're doing something similar with the courts at this point, where they've decided they don't like the judges and they're only going to put in judges who are conservative judges, conservative party member judges, and so on. So that's a second activity that is going on. That's our group that focuses on pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure, a resistance group. The third one that I would like to give you a little bit of an update on, and it's small, we have a group called Conservation Matters, and it focuses on the continuation of the protection of land and wetlands and forests and streams in Hamilton. Much of that battle was won, as you're probably all aware who are from Hamilton, in the last 3 or 4 years through the Stop Sprawl movement, prevention of the city's inclination to expand the urban boundary onto farmland, and then the slashing up of the Greenbelt by the Ford government, which got rolled back as a result of public protest. But there still are lands that are farmland, especially around the airport, that were added to the urban boundary in Hamilton in the about 2015. And they are threatened with basically warehouse development, low job and development that is basically that is deemed commercial, so it is a lower tax rate than industrial. And those lands and the waterways there, the airport happens to be on the highest point of land between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So it's the headwaters of many of the streams in Hamilton and the Hamilton area, including ones that flow down into Niagara, like the Welland River and 20 Mile Creek. So we've continued to work on trying to minimize the development there and protect as much area as possible, and convince our local government, but will eventually mean having to convince the provincial government to try and change the rules so that environmental protection becomes the primary function of lands, wetlands and forests and streams and so on, rather than the current situation where they are seen as by land speculators as a way to convert public lands or lands that are providing public benefits to private profit. So we have intervened with the Hamilton Conservation Authority in the last couple of weeks, got over 40 letters to the Conservation Authority board, and you probably read about the decision of their board unanimously to oppose new changes that the provincial government has brought in, which eliminate much of the buffer area around wetlands. It used to be 120 meters for large provincially significant wetlands, now down to 30 meters. Redefine streams so that headwater streams, the beginnings of all the waterways are no longer considered streams, so you don't have to worry about protecting them, and other things that are in this new regulation that has been imposed and is coming into effect in April. So those are some of the things that we're involved in as a group. We have other groups, other subgroups as well. You can go to our website and you'll get lots more information about what Hamilton 350 is about. And I'll stop there. And if somebody else wants to jump in, I know Lucia's on the call, Steve, Jim, others.
Thank you, Don. And thank you, Environment Hamilton, for co-hosting this webinar tonight. I know that Ian is on the call from Environment Hamilton. Thank you for everyone who has attended. Thank you. We had a lot of requests to be added to the to a membership list, which we will do after this. We will also post a recording of this this session on our website. Lucia has posted the website address in the chat. And thank you again to the three presenters. It's been a really good session. Any last minute comments from anyone else before we pull the plug on tonight? Okay.
So say thanks to everyone for coming out to this event. I hope it was helpful.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you. Bye.